Seriously. Hey everybody, it looks like the option for screen sharing is disabled at the moment, and there may be nothing we can do about that because I think the rabbi is the official host and he's out of town. I've emailed him, but probably we're gonna have to manage without it for tonight. I am putting a link to the sources in the chat, and that way at least you can see them on your own screen. It's exactly the same thing that I emailed you yesterday though, so if you have that, you should also be all set. And I am going to, I guess, just put the sources on my screen and look at them while I talk to you. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so we're starting a new chapter tonight of a new kind of Gemara. We are starting the Masechet of Sanhedrin, which is about mostly about court procedure, although there's a considerable amount about various kinds of punishments as a sort of corollary of court procedure. And the first Mishnah lists a wide variety of different things that might get discussed or decided by a Beit Din, and says what number of judges, what kind of Beit Din you would need to discuss those things. So we're going to spend most of tonight going through this list and understanding what kinds of cases it's talking about. And then we will get to the actual Gemara next week. Although we're not even going to finish the Mishnah tonight. It's a very, very long Mishnah, and it has a lot of very meaty content. If you are watching or listening to a recording of this at some point in the future and you would like a copy of the packet, please feel free to email me at deborahklapper@gmail.com. The text that we're going to be reading is the Mishnah from Sanhedrin 2a to 2b. All right, so, and I apologize that there are no vowels on the source packet. The website that I've been getting my Gemara from, unfortunately, unlike Psachim, which is what we were doing, in Sanhedrin, they haven't added the vowels yet. So hopefully they'll get their act together and do that soon. But in the meantime, they're not there. It's not such a great loss because the truth is that people can't agree on what the words sound like anyway. So the consonants are the part that everyone agrees on. All right, so we begin Dinei Mamonot Bishlosha. We adjudicate cases about money with 3 judges. And the word judges is going to be left out all the way through. It's just going to say with a number, and we're going to be expected to understand that that's a number of human beings who are on the panel of judges that are judging. Gzelot v'chavalot bishlosha. Theft and damages are also with 3. The Gemara will deal with the question of what the difference is between that and financial cases. Nezek v'chatzi nezek, tashlumei kefil v'tashlumei arba'a v'chamisha bishlosha. Okay, now we get to some more complicated cases. Nezek, which is damage. Somebody, I or my property does damage to you or your property and makes your body or your stuff less valuable. So the nezek is just the reimbursement for the lost market value of whatever it is that was damaged. Chatzi nezek is exactly what it sounds like. It's half of the value of what the damage was. And the an animal that does not have a history of doing damage in the past, and therefore the owner didn't necessarily know that they needed to provide extra control over this animal, then when that animal damages, the owner is only going to pay half of the damage that's done. The psukim, I did not send you to the psukim because there's something of a song and dance that's necessary in order to get to half of the nezek from the words in the psukim. The psukim actually say that if my ox kills your ox, then we both split both the value of the living ox and the value of the dead ox. So if the 2 oxen were of the same price to begin with, then that comes out to you getting reimbursed half because you get half of the value of my live ox. If the oxen are of very different values, then Rashi, quoting the Midrash, points out that hypothetically, the person being injured, or for that matter, even worse, the person doing the injuring, could come out making a profit off of this arrangement. That obviously does not make any sense. And so Rashi says that what we're supposed to learn is that you do what would imitate the situation if both oxen had the same value, which is to say you always give half of the value. Tashlumei kefel is a double payment. If I burglarize your house and they catch me with your stuff, then I have to give it back to you and I also have to pay for it. So I end up paying double. So that's a double payment. That is presumably meant as a disincentive for stealing, because if the worst that could happen when they catch me is that I just have to give the stuff back, then what do I lose? I might as well try. So this acts as a disincentive. Tashlumei arba'a v'chamisha are payments of 4 or 5 times the value. That is what happens if I steal your sheep or your cow. And then by the time they catch me, I have either sold the animal or I have killed the animal. And in that case, in the case of a sheep, I pay you for it 4 times. In the case of a cow, I pay you for it 5 times. The citation for the psukim for all of these are in the footnotes. Ha'ones v'hamifateh, I'm sorry, I left off the citations here, so I'll give them to you now. An ones is a man who rapes a single woman, and a mifateh is a man who seduces a single woman. The ones is found in Devarim 22, 28, and 29, where it says that his punishment is that he has to pay a fine, and he also has to, supposing that she is interested in such an arrangement and her father is interested in such an arrangement, he also has to marry the girl, and he's never allowed to divorce her unless she wants to be divorced. About 1,000 years ago, Rabbeinu Gershom got rid of divorce against the wife's will for everybody, but this is the only case in which the Torah doesn't allow divorce against the wife's will. The mifateh can be found in Shmot 22, 15, and 6. 15 and 16. This is a man who seduces a single woman, and he also pays a fine. The amount is not specified, but it says the amount that is given as a dowry for a maiden, whatever that is. And he also has to offer to marry her. Okay, so those cases are grouped here together with the case of the Motzi Shemra, who I believe I did not give the psukim for that. Okay, sorry about that. The Motzi Shemra is the guy who comes to the court the day after he gets married and says, my wife turns out not to be a virgin, and he accuses her of committing adultery after the time of the Kiddushin and before he took her home. In order for this to make sense, you have to know that up until at least the end of the period of the time of the Gemara, and maybe beyond that, standard practice was to do the first half of the marriage ceremony, the part where the Chatan gives the Kala the ring, and where they become married in the sense that she's no longer able to marry anybody else, and it would be adultery for her to sleep with anybody else. They become married at that point, but they did that stage, and then they would wait 6 months to a year, depending on local custom, before finishing the marriage ceremony and doing the Sheva Brachot and actually moving in together. So what the man here is accusing the woman of would be almost physically impossible the way we do weddings. But in the world of the Torah and the Mishnah and the Gemara was totally possible, because she was going to go back as a technically married, but not in any useful way, woman to her parents' house and live there for 6 to 12 months. And so he's coming and claiming that she committed adultery during that time period. The normal outcome of this is for him to be fined and beaten by the court, by the way, largely on the theory that he couldn't possibly know that unless he had far too much experience for him to be a good person. Unless he actually has witnesses that she committed adultery, in which case it becomes a capital case against her, which we'll get to in a second. But so these three cases, the Ones, the Mafata, and the Motzi Shemra, are decided also by three judges, according to Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim Omrim, but the Chachamim said, Motzi Shemra be'esrim v'shlosha, that the Motzi Shemra, the defamer, gets judged by a court of 23, because it has included in it also a capital case, because in the event that she gets convicted of adultery, that's a capital case. Okay. That's the end of that section of the Mishnah, mostly dealing with financial issues. Makot bishlosha, lashes are decided with 3. But Mishum Rabbi Yishmael Amru be'esrim v'shlosha. But Rabbi Yishmael said that lashes are judged with 23, which seems to be a question of whether beating people is more similar to charging them fines, where we are quite clear that that's a 3-person court, or more similar to a death penalty, where we're clear that that's a 23-person court. And the first position seems to hold that beating people is just sort of a more serious version of charging them money, and Rabbi Yishmael holds that it's sort of a less serious version of killing. Okay, Ibur HaChodesh Bishlosha. The calendar as we have it, and I think we've discussed this before, but not in this kind of specific way. The calendar as we have it is produced using calculations and astronomy, and is produced well in advance and is already decided in a way that theoretically could go on forever. But that's not the way it was originally supposed to be, and it's not the way that it was at the beginning of the Mishnaic period, and that they sort of assumed they were going to go back to even once they had switched. The old system was that you would sit there, the court would sit there in the Lishkat HaGazit in the Beit HaMikdash, and the witnesses would come to testify that they had seen the moon after the moon shrank and disappeared, and then the witnesses would come to say that they had seen the new moon. And if, when interviewing the witnesses, the judges thought that these people were telling the truth, then they would sanctify the month, and that day would become Rosh Chodesh. If it didn't become Rosh Chodesh, the next day became Rosh Chodesh. But sometimes in order to manipulate the Chagim so that they come out on the right day of the week, you would decide not to sanctify the day, even if witnesses came, which is easy enough to accomplish by disbanding the court and refusing to accept the witnesses or by refusing to believe them. So there's a little bit of a decision-making process involved here. So Ibur HaChodesh is the decision to make a month into a leap month from the same root as Ayin Bet Resh, that for pregnancy, I suppose on the theory that a pregnant woman is slightly more than one person and a leap month is slightly more than 1 month. That's the less interesting part of this line. Ibur HaShana is slightly more interesting. Ibur HaShana Bishlosha, the leaping of a year, that's a decision that is made quite explicitly. The lunar cycle is only 29 and a half days long, and so 12 lunar months comes to 354 days. So if you do not adjust the year to keep it adjusted to the seasons, then the lunar year falls back 11 and a quarter days each year, and eventually any date can fall in any season of the year. But the Torah is very clear that Pesach is supposed to be in the spring. And in particular, the Torah is very clear that you're supposed to begin the barley harvest with the Korban HaOmer, which is offered on the second day of Pesach. So you have to adjust the calendar so that Pesach always falls at the beginning of the barley harvest. And in order to do that, the judges had a collection, which we will, I believe, get to later in this parak. They had a collection of weather-related standards that they would apply sometime a couple of months before Pesach, and they would decide whether there were going to be 2 Adars in order to push Pesach a month later, or whether there was only going to be 1 Adar. And that decision, according to Rabbi Meir, is made with 3 judges. Notice that this is here a decision that in the American legal system, we would probably consider that to be more of a legislative or executive function. But the Beit Din in the conception of Masechet Sanhedrin is both the legislature and the judicial branch, and carries some of what we would think of as the powers of the executive branch as well, partly because they're supposed to, and partly because the kingship, in a way that the rabbis of the Mishnah trusted or believed in, did not exist anymore by now. They're, at the beginning of the Mishnaic period, there are still Jewish kings of Judea, but they're not from the Davidic line, and they're not from, and they're sort of toadies of the Romans in a way that's not really, doesn't really make them kings from our perspective. So from here on in the Mishnah, a lot of the things that the Beit Din is going to do are not really going to be judicial functions. Okay. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Bishlosha Matchilin. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says you begin the process of adding a month to the year with 3 judges. And if those 3 judges decide that it's worth having a conversation about it, then Uva Chamisha Nosin V'Notnin, then you debate the question with 5 judges. You add 2 more judges and then have the debate. And if those 5 judges decide that it's a good idea to make a decision, then you move to the next level, and v'gomrim b'shiva, and then you can actually conclude the issue with 7 judges. You add 2 more judges. But he says v'im gamru b'shlosha me'uberet. But he says if you just did the whole process with the original 3 judges and made a decision, it works. It's not how you're supposed to do it, but it works. All right. The next case is a case that is not 100% clear what the mission is talking about. Smichat zikenim is the laying of hands of elders, and I am translating that hyper literally and vaguely because it might mean one of 2 things, and the grammar of the phrase is different depending on which meaning it has. It may describe the appointment of new zikenim, of new elders, which was done metaphorically by laying on hands, sort of in imitation of the way in Sefer Devarim that Moshe gives some of his prophetic powers, I don't know, whatever it is he's transferring to Yehoshua by putting his hands on his head. So we call it laying of hands. The commentaries seem to think that the rabbis didn't actually put their hands on their students' heads when they did this, although how anyone would know, I don't know. So that might be what we're talking about here. Or we may be talking about a different laying on of hands that is done by Zikanim, which is that when the central court that meets in Yerushalayim, the Sanhedrin, makes a mistake in law and publicizes a mistaken decision, and then the majority of the Jewish people commits a grievous sin as a result of this mistake, there is a sacrifice that the elders themselves bring to atone for their part in leading everybody in sin. And that sacrifice, a par ha'elam davar shel tzibur, the bull of the mistaken thing of the community, that bull needs to have the hands of the judges laid down on its head. So that might be what we're talking about. It's not clear. Either way, that is done with 3, as is the Arifat Eglah. The Arifat Eglah is this very strange procedure, which I think the citation is in the footnote. Yes, in Devarim 21, in which you have a murder. You find what appears to be a murder victim in between cities. You don't find a murderer, remembering that even today with the relatively considerable resources that we have available, there are a lot of murders that go unsolved, and without modern detective techniques and without the kind of money that our governments have now, very likely almost all crimes would go unsolved. In any case, you don't find the murderer. Instead, you do this procedure that involves the judges gathering together on a riverbank and killing a calf and washing their hands in the river and saying, we didn't kill the guy. It's a very, very strange procedure. In any case, that is the Arifat Eglah. That is also, according to Rabbi Shimon, done with 3, but Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'chamisha. Rabbi Yehuda says that is done with 5. Hachalitza v'hamiunin bishlosha. Chalitza and miunin are done with 3. Those are both ways out of marriage that are not exactly divorce, but otherwise they don't have a lot in common. Chalitza is a procedure described in the Torah. I'm sorry, the footnotes at the bottom of the page seem to have doubled their numbers in several cases. I don't know why. The procedure described in the Torah in Devarim chapter 25 in which if a man dies childless but married, his wife is supposed to marry his brother to produce a child for him in a procedure called yibum. But if, as the Torah describes it, the man doesn't want to fulfill his responsibilities, or also if the woman is not interested in marrying him, or today, when we consider the entire thing to be sort of disturbing and creepy, and by we, I mean at least 1,000 years worth of Ashkenazim, this isn't a modern, thinking that this is not a good idea is by no means a modern phenomenon. So in the Ashkenazi world, for at least 1,000 years, everybody has done chalitza. But so the way you get out of having to do yibum is that in front of a court, the widow takes her brother-in-law's shoe off and spits at him, and this declaration that's made. It's a very strange procedure. In any case, that's called chalitza, and the Mishnah here says that it requires a court of 3 judges. Mi'un is a rabbinic procedure. This is not in the Torah. It is intended to dissolve a marriage that, as far as the Torah is concerned, does not exist at all, which the Torah made provision for the possibility of a father marrying off a daughter who is a child, meaning who is not yet 12. And that's a real marriage that would require a real divorce to get out of. But the Torah makes no provision for a minor girl to get married if her father is dead. The rabbis very reasonably concluded that the girl most desperate to find a home for herself, willing to get married in order to find one, was probably actually the orphan, and that this girl also needed a way to get married. And so they created a form of rabbinic marriage for an underage girl that could be contracted by her mother or by her older brother. But because the Torah doesn't recognize this as marriage at all, it's relatively easy to get out of. All she has to do in order to get out of it is go to court and say, I don't like the guy, I don't want to be married to him. And they write her a document that says, you know, in front of our court on such and such a day, this girl declared that she doesn't like to be married to so-and-so, and now she's not married to him anymore. And that process is called mi'un. And that also, according to the Mishnah here, is done with a court of 3. We do not, by the way, do child marriage of any description anymore, because thank God we have come up with better ways of keeping orphans from starving to death. Okay, next. Neta ravai umaaser sheni she'ein damim yeduin bishlosha. So neta ravai and maaser sheni are 2 different kinds of food that you might need to buy from yourself for a fair market price. And we're here saying that the court that's going to decide what the fair market price is going to have 3 judges on it. Okay, so what are these things? Neta ravai happens when if you plant fruit trees, and this first part is true no matter where on the planet you plant them. If you plant fruit trees, then for the first 3 years after you plant them, the fruit is not kosher. It's something called orla. And that's true, by the way, of seedlings, which are unlikely to produce fruit for the first 3 years, but it's also true of a mature tree that you transplant, which is the case where it's more likely to actually produce fruit within 3 years. In Chutz La'aretz, after the first 3 years, you're done. You can eat the fruit. In Eretz Yisrael, however, the 4th year has a special status, and the fruit from that year is meant to be eaten by its owners in Yerushalayim in a state of holiness and purity. Now, because fruit is heavy, and you might live really and perishable, and you might live really far from Yerushalayim, the Torah also says that if you prefer, you can exchange the fruit for money, carry the money to Yerushalayim, because money will last for years in your pocket. It does not perishable, and it's much lighter to carry. You can carry the money to Yerushalayim, buy whatever food you want there, and eat that in Yerushalayim in a state of holiness and purity. Today, since there is no possibility of eating anything in a state of holiness and purity, we exchange the fruit for the smallest conceivable possible amount of money and then destroy the money. But that is not what we're talking about here. We're talking here about a case where you're going to pay yourself fair market value and then carry the fruit to Yerushalayim. If, by the way, if you redeem it by selling it to somebody else, they pay the actual fair market value. If you redeem it by giving yourself money, you redeem it for 125% of fair market value, 1.25. Which is the same thing that's going to happen to this Maaser Sheni. Now, the way Maaser Sheni gets produced is as follows. When you grow grain, or according to most positions, also fruit in the land of Israel, there are a number of, we usually translate them as gifts, but the truth is they're taxes, they're mandatory, that need to be taken from your produce before the produce is kosher to eat. And each one has different rules. And we'll just go through some of them in order to get as far as Maaser Sheni so we can know what it is. And the first thing you take off is something called truma. There isn't a specific amount according to the Torah, but the rabbi said to give between a 60th and a 40th of your crop. The truma goes to a Kohen and needs to be eaten by a Kohen or an immediate member of his family in a state of tahara, of purity. The next gift is Maaser Rishon, the first tithe, which is 10% of the crop, and that goes to a Levi. It has further taxes that need to be removed from it, but we're not going to follow that path right now. Let's follow the other path with the rest of your crop. The next thing you take off is Maaser Sheni, the second tithe. The second tithe in years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle. So not this year, I believe this year is year 6 of the Shemitah cycle, but in years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle belongs to you, to the farmer, and needs, like the Netter Avai, to be taken to Yerushalayim and eaten there in a state of holiness and purity. Like the Netter Avai, because this stuff is perishable and it's heavy, the Torah allows you instead to exchange it for money, carry the money to Yerushalayim, and use the money to buy food there and eat that in a state of holiness and purity. And like the Netter Avai, if you sell it to a stranger, you're going to charge them the fair market price, and that money then becomes Maaser Sheni money. And if you redeem it yourself, you're going to have to pay 125% of the fair market value. But I'm throwing around the words fair market value as if it's just, obvious what a silo full of barley is supposed to be worth. That might not be obvious, and that is why this court here of 3 people is being convened. Probably they have to have some kind of expertise in the kind of fruits or vegetables that you're redeeming to determine what the official value is of the stuff that you're redeeming. Okay, on to the next case. Hekteshot bishlosha. So hekteshot are objects that you have donated to the Beit HaMikdash. Now, if you donate animals in pristine condition to the Beit HaMikdash, those are just going to be sacrifices. But almost anything else that you donate is not useful to the institution and is going to get sold at auction, and then the money gets used to, pay the people who repair the walls and make new clothes for the Kohanim and all that kind of stuff. If you want to redeem the stuff yourself instead of having it sold at auction, either because you've changed your mind about donating it or because your whole point in donating it to begin with was as an excuse to make a financial donation, then they do, again, an appraisal of what the fair market value is so that you can pay 125% of that and get your stuff back. And Hekteshot Bishlosha is telling us that the panel that's doing that appraisal is going to have 3 judges on it to decide what the value is. Okay, now we get to arachin. Arachin is a very, very strange thing. All of these things have been pretty strange, actually. At the end of Sefer Vayikra, the Torah lists financial values by age and gender of a variety of different people, so that if you swear that you're going to give a person to the Beit HaMikdash, you pay this amount of money instead. I think this is in its original context in Chumash. This is a very, very powerful statement that we don't do human sacrifice. We have no interest in human sacrifice. It is not possible to dedicate a human being as a sacrifice. If you try to dedicate a human being as a sacrifice, we just make you give money instead. I think that it's making a very important religious point. But it also seems that people actually donated money this way, that people found it to be a compelling way to decide how much money to donate. So our Mishnah here is dealing with, though, if suppose that you dedicated a person, but you don't actually have enough money to pay off what you now committed, and you want to pay it off in stuff instead of in cash. So here we are at the top of the next page of the packet. It says, Ha'arachin ha'metaltalin bishlosha. If you're doing arachin, if you're doing values of people with metaltalin is movable property, then we have a panel of 3 judges who are going to appraise your stuff and decide, how much of it and which stuff is worth the right amount of money, and then take it from you. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Echad Mehen Kohen. Rabbi Yehuda says one of those 3 people on the panel needs to be a Kohen. V'akarkaot tish'ah v'kohen. And if you're going to pay the erech with real estate as opposed to with movable property, metaltalin, then that gets appraised with 10 judges and 1 Kohen. So, 9 judges and 1 Kohen, which is 10 judges, including 1 Kohen. The Adam kayotze behed. And if you promise to give the value, not the erech of a person, right? The assigned value that's at the end of Sefer Vayikra for, a person of the whatever gender between age X and age Y, but instead you said, I would like to give the value of me on the slave market to the temple, then we assemble a panel of 10 judges, one of whom is a Kohen, to decide what your fair market value would be on a slave market. This obviously is a rather incoherent thing to be talking about in a world in which slavery is not an everyday existential issue, and prices for human beings are not even really a legitimate topic of conversation, let alone a thing that you could just determine by going to the store. Thank God, it's much better to live without such a thing. But remember, keeping in mind that in the world of the Mishnah, slavery and slave markets were in fact a very real thing. And people might in fact say, I am the servant of God. I would like to give God my price, my value as a slave. In which case, then you need an official, professional official appraisal of how much money that is. All right, back to judicial issues. Dinei nefashot be'esrim v'shlosha. Capital cases with 23. And it's worth noting here that although there are a lot of mitzvot in the Torah that the Torah assigns a death penalty to, the Mishnah in Makot, not here, but in Masechet Makot, it speaks about, how frequently people were actually put to death. And there's a machloket there about how many death penalties is too many. But the machloket is between the person who says that putting one person to death every 7 years is too many. I think this is on a national level. And the person who says putting one person to death every 70 years is too many. And the person who says, had I been there, they never would have put anyone to death at all. So as a theoretical matter, the death penalty is all over the Torah and is all over Masechet Sanhedrin. As a practical matter, it seems to have been almost non-existent, which is possibly the way it should be. It's important to make the statement that there are some crimes for which you deserve to lose your life, while at the same time also not actually killing people. Okay. The next few cases, though, are being put to death, but they're not actually humans. Harovea v'hanirva, these are both animals. The rovea is a male animal that was involved in an act of bestiality with a human woman, and a nirva is a probably female animal, although maybe it doesn't matter, who was involved in an act of bestiality with a human male. Either way, those animals are put to death with a court of 23. And we are having a death penalty court case with 23 judges sitting and judging whether or not to kill a sheep. That's what this is. Okay, Shne'emar v'haragta et ha'isha ve'et ha'behema. The pasuk there, where it talks about bestiality, says, kill the woman and the animal. And then ve'omer, it says in the next pasuk, ve'et ha'behema taharogu, it says, and kill the animal. And I am sorry, it looks like I only translated the second half of that line in the translation. I should have proofread this better. In any case, it connects the killing of the human in this bestiality relationship with the killing of the animal, so we have the same procedure for both. Shor haniskal, Shor haniskal is another kind of animal, which we are going to kill using a court of 23 as if he was a person. A shor haniskal is an ox who killed a human. And the pasuk there says, Shne'emar hashor yisakel v'gam ba'alav yumat. The pasuk says, stone the ox and also kill the owner. But there's a slightly longer version of the midrash that this Mishnah is alluding to that responds to that more or less with, we don't actually kill people because their animals went crazy. That's can't possibly mean that. I don't believe it means we're supposed to kill the owner. So instead, it must mean what the next line of the Mishnah says here: K'mitat ba'alim kach mitat ashor. That we kill the ox in the way that we would have killed the owner if it had been appropriate to kill him, meaning we have due process and a court of 23 and then a ordinary human death penalty for this bull or cow. They killed a person. All right, which gets us onto the topic of dangerous animals. Haze'ev v'ha'ari hadov v'hanamer habardoles v'hanachash mitatan ve'esrim v'shlosha. So a wolf, a lion, a bear, and a tiger, bardoles, it's not entirely clear what that is. Jastrow says it's something spotted, maybe a leopard, maybe a hyena. And the snake, they're killed by a court of 23. The same as the ox, in other words, if they killed a human. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kol HaKodem L'Horgan Zacha. But Rabbi Eliezer says, for those animals, whoever kills them first wins. And it seems that in this case, we're talking not about a wild lion, bear, tiger, bardolis, or snake, but a pet one. If they were wild, I don't think we would have let them live in close association with humans long enough to kill a person to start with. And we would certainly kill them as soon as possible once they started attacking people. But in this case, we're talking about somebody's private property who is a supposedly tame pet animal that killed somebody. And so the first position in the Mishnah and Rabbi Akiva, who we'll see in a second, says that, it's not any different than an ox. It was a tame animal. It went crazy. We have a court case, and if we find it guilty, we kill it. And Rabbi Eliezer says, no, I'm sorry, those animals didn't belong in human society to begin with. Just kill it. Okay, Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva Omer, mitatan ve'esrim v'shlosha. Rabbi Akiva says their death is with 23, which seems to be saying the same thing as the first position. The Gemara is, when we get there, going to tell us that the difference is that Rabbi Akiva is perfectly fine with just killing snakes. It's the other ones that he's returning to the first position on. Okay. Ein danin lo et shevet v'lo et hanavi sheker v'lo et kohen gadol ela al pi beit din shel shivim ve'echad. Okay, so now we have a list of 3 kinds of cases that can only be judged with a court of 71. We've upped the ante here. It was 23 until now. Okay, so you can't have a court case against an entire tribe, and you can't try a false prophet or a high priest unless you have a court of 71, because these are, I guess, matters of national importance. It's not just a case about an individual person. And we'll go on to some more cases of national importance here. And you can't send out the army to a permitted war. No, not a required war. A required war would be a different story entirely, and the king would be empowered to just go do that without the involvement of the court system at all. But a permitted war is a different story, and the Beit Din does have to be involved. You can't send out the army to a permitted war unless you have a court of 71. Ein mosifin al ha'ir, you can't add to the city of Yerushalayim, val ha'azarot, or to the temple, ela al pi beit din shel shivim ve'echad, unless you have a vote of a court of 71, because again, this is going to permanently affect all kinds of mitzvot that have to be done in, or for that matter, outside of the city of Yerushalayim or the Beit HaMikdash. And so you can't change those boundaries without a court of 71 representing the whole Jewish people. Ein osin Sanhedriot lishvatim el al pi beit din shel shivim ve'echad. And likewise, you can only establish new courts for the tribes using a beit din of 71. Ein osin ir hanidachat el al pi beit din shel shivim ve'echad. You can only make an ir hanidachat with a court of 71. Ir hanidachat is our last new mitzvah for the evening. In the 13th chapter of Devarim, the Torah tells us that if an entire city is judged to have gone over to idolatry, the entire city is destroyed, all the people are killed, everything, all the stuff in the city is piled in the streets, and then the place is burned to the ground. It's worth noting that there will be a dispute later on in the Gemara whether this ever happened, and in fact, whether it was ever even intended to happen. But the Mishnah treats it as at least as a potentially real case. And that would also get judged by a court of 71. And while we're talking about how to do an Ir Hanidachat, that makes one more note about the Ir Hanidachat. Ein osin Ir Hanidachat b'safar. You don't make an Ir Hanidachat at the border of the country, because it's not good for national security to have a hole in the population at the edge of the country where there used to be a city and now nobody lives there. It's too easy to invade through that space. Velo shalosh, and you can't make three Ir Hanidachats next to each other, again, for the same reason, because it impairs national security. Aval osin echad oshnayim, but you can make one, or you can even make two next to each other, but as long as it's not at the border, but not three, even if it's not at the border. Although, as I said, it is not clear in the entire history of the Jewish people that there has ever even been a total of one Ir Hanidachat, let alone two or three, let alone next to each other. Okay, that is the end of what we're doing this evening, which is good because I've already gone 5 minutes over time. But next week we'll finish the Mishnah and we'll go on to the Gemara. Are there questions?
Hi, Deborah. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Quick question. So thank you for all this. So it's interesting thinking about the number of judges. Some of the numbers like 3, I could imagine sort of how you would, end up there, or what the significance is, or 10, like an Eidah, like a minion. But I'm just curious, is the Gemara going to talk about sort of what is magical about the number, for example, 23 or 71? Is that going to be discussed at some point, like where that number even comes from?
Yes, in fact, it's in the Mishnah. It's not even in the Gemara. It's in the next bit of the Mishnah that right after where we just stopped. So we'll do a quick preview of next week. The number 23 comes from the need to have a minion on either side of a dispute. If you're voting, you need to have a minion in favor and a minion against. And in order to convict, you need a majority of at least 2. So that would get you to 22. But you can't have an even number, so that gets you to 23. They have psukim for all of this, and it's slightly more complicated than that, but that's more or less how you get to 23. 71 is in imitation of the Council of Elders that Moshe sets up in Sefer Shemot. No, maybe that's not true. Maybe it's in Sefer Bamidbar, but in the Torah, Moshe sets up a council of 70 elders, and either you include Moshe, you say it was 70 elders plus Moshe, so that's 71.
Okay.
Or you just say we don't like we don't like even numbers, and so you make it 71 anyway.
I noticed that they're all prime also.
That is really interesting. I had not noticed that, except for 10. You can have a panel of 10 for the decision of the value of real estate, which is also the only even number that they allowed. I don't know if the primeness is important. I have to think about that. The oddness certainly is, because they don't want to have tied votes. As you know, for obvious reasons, it makes a mess out of your policy.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I'd like to bring up something that's not directly relevant.
Sure.
Which is we have a set of Shulchan Aruch that's hardly ever been touched, that we would like to find a good home for. So I wanted to offer it to this class first before I put it on Jewish Sharon.
That was very sweet. Thank you.
There is, we're not asking anything for it. We just wanted, the books are feeling very lonely. They only get touched once a year when we clean the shelf for Pesach. So they would like to find a good home.
Okay. So if anybody wants to respond they should respond to Harvey.
Yes.
About that. I have a question, not directly about class, which is, I suppose it's a good thing that I didn't ask this question earlier, because at the moment I'm actually sick, so it wouldn't have happened anyway. But in theory, in the event that people are healthy, are people interested in meeting whoever wants to in person with a Zoom camera also running, so that if people want to, they can be remote? Or is it better to keep going the way we are? You don't have to answer that right this minute. You could even email me your thoughts about that. And in the event that weather was pleasant, we could consider meeting outdoors somewhere at my house or in the sukkah at Shul or something like that, as I guess, an in-between. But so I invite thoughts about that. My plan would be to continue to have the Zoom available for people who want, if only because it automatically records the class, and I do like having a recording on YouTube. But email me your thoughts about whether we should also have an in-person option. All right, any other questions about class?
Deborah, are any of the other shul classes starting to meet in person?
So the ones that are on Shabbat, some of them have been meeting in person for a while now, but outside, but they have now sort of moved inside on Shabbat, right? The after Hashkama Shir has restarted, I believe, even indoors. And I think the rabbi's been speaking between Mincha and Mariv on Shabbat for months.
Yes, he has.
The weeknight stuff, we've moved the summer Beit Midrash related class that my husband gives to indoors, but my understanding is that last Tuesday when it met for the first time, nobody actually came to the indoor part, and he spoke to an empty room and a Zoom camera, and all the people were actually remote. So it may be that we misjudged whether people were interested in doing that.
So
the answer is sort of.
Yeah, I think people have gotten so used to just being home in their pajamas.
I'm perfectly happy to make Torah available to people in their pajamas. I
love it.
I have no problem with that. I just, if people would prefer that I show up to shul wearing clothes, I'm willing to do that too. So, okay. So let me know your thoughts. Either way, I will see you guys next Monday night at 8. I don't see why not. In the meantime, have a safe fast, and I'll see you next week.
Terrific. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks.